I want you to picture a map of the world. Just, the standard world map.
Okay.
Now, imagine taking a giant eraser and wiping out almost every political border you recognize. So, no United States, no Brazil, no unified Germany.
Right. Just a blank slate.
Exactly. We are going back to a really specific window of time, roughly between the 15th and 18th centuries, where the map wasn't just being drawn, it was being fought over, inch by bloody inch.
Yeah. And we usually call this the Age of Exploration, which, I mean, it sounds very noble, like it was just about brave captains looking at the horizon.
But when you actually look at the sources we have today for this deep dive, that's not really the vibe at all.
Not even a little bit. It's less Star Trek exploration and more like a global, organized crime thriller. The sources referred to this era as the Atlantic Ascendant.
The Atlantic Ascendant.
Right.
Yeah.
It's this pivotal moment when humanity moved from regional squabbles, fighting over a single valley or a peninsula, to a high-stakes, cutthroat competition for the entire planet.
Which is wild to think about.
It really is. This is the story of how 5 specific European powers, so we're talking Portugal, Spain, France, England, and the Netherlands, how they broke out of their continent and completely rewired the global economy.
And what really jumped out at me in the reading is that it wasn't just about who could plant the most flags. It was a clash of business models.
Yes, absolutely.
You have these 5 distinct strategies for how to build an empire, because some wanted land, some wanted trade routes, and some just wanted to control the money supply.
And that distinction is crucial. It explains why the world looks the way it does today. So our mission here is to unpack the strategies of these first movers and the challengers who came after them.
Because that thirst for silver and spices and sugar, it didn't just make a few kings rich.
No, it fundamentally altered the internal balance of power in Europe. And, as the sources emphasize, it devastated populations across the Americas and Africa.
Right. So let's set the board. If this is a strategy game, Portugal makes the first move. And frankly, looking at their position on the map, they didn't really have a choice, did they?
They really didn't. They're stuck on the edge of the Iberian Peninsula.
Yeah.
That's the key context here. In the 15th century, Europe was obsessed with Asian spices: pepper, cloves, nutmeg.
But the land routes to get those goods were entirely controlled by the Ottoman Empire and other Muslim powers in the Middle East. They held the keys to the warehouse.
Exactly. And Portugal is physically blocked from the Mediterranean trade networks by Spain. They are essentially in a geopolitical cul-de-sac.
So swim or starve?
Essentially, yes.
Oh.
So under Prince Henry the Navigator, they decided if they couldn't go through the house, they'd go around the block.
Right.
They started charting the coast of Africa, inching their way south. It took decades of trial and error, but it culminated in Vasco da Gama's voyage in 1497.
Which changes everything.
It does. He rounds the Cape of Good Hope, sails up East Africa, and hits India. Suddenly, the middleman is completely cut out.
But here is the strategic twist that I found so fascinating. Portugal didn't try to conquer India?
No.
They didn't have the manpower for that anyway. So they went for what the sources call a trade post empire.
Yeah, think of it like a modern logistics giant, like Amazon or FedEx. Portugal didn't care about owning the factories or the farms. They cared about the shipping lanes.
Because they realized that if you control the maritime choke point,
Right, places like Goa in India or Malacca in Southeast Asia.
or the Strait of Hormuz.
Exactly. If you hold those spots, you can tax 100% of the trade while only occupying a tiny fraction of the land.
It's a low overhead, high margin business model. You don't have to govern millions of people. You just have to control the toll booth.
Precisely. It was a strategy of surgical precision. They fortified these coastal hubs and used their naval superiority to force merchant traffic through them. So they created a monopoly on the spice trade, not by owning the spice itself, but by owning the ocean.
Which stands in complete contrast to their neighbor, Spain.
Very much so.
Because when Spain enters the chat a few years later, they aren't looking for toll booths, they're looking for real estate.
Spain went for the territorial conquest model. When Columbus stumbled upon the Americas, Spain didn't just want to trade with the locals. They wanted to replace the leadership and absorb the land directly into the Spanish crown.
And this is where we see the conquistadors come in.
Right. Men like Hernán Cortés, taking down the Aztec Empire between 1519 and 1521, and Francisco Pizarro dismantling the Inca Empire just over a decade later in 1532 and 1533.
But we have to be really careful not to fall into the great man myth here, right? Because the sources are very specific that this wasn't just about Spanish military genius or better steel.
Far from it.
There was a biological weapon at play, even if it wasn't intentional.
Yeah, this is the grim reality of what the sources call the mechanisms of dominance. The Spanish brought smallpox, measles, and influenza to a population that had zero immunity to those diseases.
And the demographic collapse was just apocalyptic.
It was. We're talking about mortality rates of up to 90% in some regions. When Cortés attacked Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, the defenders were already dying by the thousands from smallpox. It completely hollowed out the resistance.
And once that resistance was broken, Spain just pivoted straight to extraction. Because if Portugal's engine was spices, Spain's engine was silver.
Oceans of it. They found massive deposits in Potosi, which is in modern-day Bolivia, and Zacatecas in Mexico.
Wow.
And they set this massive mining operation that pumped silver into the global economy on a scale nobody had ever seen before.
But here's where the economics get a bit tricky in the sources. Because Spain becomes the richest country in Europe, the superpower of the 16th century.
Yeah.
But it implies that this wealth was almost a trap.
It was a massive trap.
Like they were spending the money before they even dug it up?
That's the fatal flaw in the Spanish model. The crown treated the silver like a credit card with absolutely no limit. They used it to finance massive armies to fight wars all over Europe against the French, the Ottomans, the Protestants.
But they weren't building anything at home.
Exactly. Because they were just extracting wealth rather than building a domestic industry, they ended up with massive inflation and crushing debt. They were rich in cash, but extremely poor in economic structure.
So before we see how that debt comes back to bite them, we have to address the tension between these two giants. You have Portugal going east and Spain going west. Eventually, they are going to bump into each other.
Oh, it got very tense very quickly. After Columbus returned in 1493, Spain claimed the Caribbean, and Portugal famously objected. They essentially said, hey, we have prior rights to Atlantic exploration.
And it looked like they were going to go to war right then and there.
It really did.
And the solution was the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, which, to a modern ear, sounds absolutely insane.
It's wild.
The Pope steps in and literally draws a line down the map of the world.
It is arguably the most audacious act of geopolitical regulation in history. Pope Alexander VI drew a line of demarcation 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands.
Just a straight line.
A straight line. He decreed that everything discovered west of that line belonged to Spain, and everything east belonged to Portugal.
It's like a massive antitrust ruling, but instead of breaking up a company, he divided the entire planet. Just, you get the Americas, you get Africa and Asia.
And the crazy part is, for a while, it actually worked as a stabilizing force between the two Iberian powers. It prevented immediate war. It's actually why Brazil speaks Portuguese today. The coastline jutted out just enough to cross the line into the Portuguese side.
But there was a major problem with this treaty that the sources point out.
Right.
Nobody bothered to ask France, England, or the Netherlands.
Exactly. The King of France famously asked to see Adam's will to prove that the world belonged only to Spain and Portugal.
I love that quote.
It's perfect, because by the 17th century, the Iberian monopoly was over. The challengers arrived, and they brought entirely new strategies that made the Spanish and Portuguese models look completely outdated.
So let's talk about those challengers. You have France, England, and the Netherlands. They are late to the party, so all the easy land is already taken. They have to innovate. Let's start with France. What was their play in North America?
France faced a serious reality check. The Spanish controlled the gold and silver zones in the south. So the French were stuck with the North modern-day Canada and the U.S. Midwest. They founded Quebec in 1608.
Right. And it was cold, and there wasn't any gold?
No gold at all, but there was fur. Beaver pelts were the ultimate luxury item of the era in Europe.
But you can't strip mine beaver pelts the way you do silver. You need a steady, ongoing supply from the interior.
Right. And France didn't have the population back home to send thousands of soldiers to occupy that vast territory. So they developed what the sources call a relationship-based empire.
Interesting.
They relied heavily on alliances with indigenous groups, like the Huron Confederacy, to facilitate the fur trade. French traders lived among them, learned the languages, and often married into local families.
So it was an empire built on trade diplomacy.
Because it had to be. They didn't have the numbers to do it any other way.
Then you have the English. They land on the Atlantic coast of North America and down on the Caribbean, and they take a very different approach. They aren't looking for trade partners. They're looking to basically replicate England.
Yes, England prioritized settler colonialism. Their economic model wasn't primarily about extraction or trading with locals, it was agricultural.
So we're talking about tobacco.
Tobacco in Virginia, and later, sugar in the Caribbean. And these crops require land, lots of it, and labor.
And this brings us to the concept of mercantilism, which the sources mention as the driving philosophy of the British Empire. It's basically a zero-sum game, right?
That's the absolute best way to describe it. Mercantilism is the belief that global wealth is a fixed pie. If Spain has a slice, that's a slice England doesn't have.
So there's no growing the pie.
No. So the goal of the state is to maximize exports, minimize imports, and accumulate as much gold and silver as possible. To do that, England needed colonies that would only trade with the mother country.
So the colonies exist solely to feed the economic engine of London.
Exactly. And because they needed so much land for this agricultural engine, the English model was inherently more hostile to indigenous populations than the French model was.
Because their goals were at odds.
Right. The French needed the indigenous people alive and cooperative to hunt beavers. The English needed the indigenous people gone so they could plant tobacco.
Which brings us to the third challenger, and honestly, this is the one that seems to have rewritten the rules of capitalism itself. The Netherlands.
The Dutch are the absolute game changers here. In the 1600s, they were a tiny nation actively fighting for independence from Spain.
Right.
They knew they couldn't outmanpower the Spanish, so they decided to outfinance them.
This is where we see the invention of the joint stock company.
Yes. This is the massive aha moment of the 17th century. Remember how Spain financed its empire through the crown, borrowing money from bankers based on future silver shipments?
Yeah, I'm getting buried in debt.
Right. It was cumbersome and risky. The Dutch created the Dutch East India Company, or the VOC, and they allowed regular citizens to buy shares in the company.
They essentially crowdsourced their imperialism.
They really did. And this gave them massive amounts of liquid cash, liquidity that Spain just didn't have. They used this money to build a huge fleet and hire mercenary armies.
And they went straight after Portugal, didn't they?
They didn't just compete with Portugal in the Indian Ocean. They executed a hostile takeover. They physically seized those Portuguese ports we talked about earlier. They fought for control of Malacca, Ceylon, parts of Indonesia.
So it wasn't even a war for territory in the traditional sense. It was a corporate war for market share.
It was corporate raiding with cannons. The Dutch proved that a republic with deep pockets and a highly sophisticated banking system could beat a monarchy with a lot of land. They basically became the warehouse of the world.
So now we have a really crowded map. You've got 5 powers, all operating under this mercantilist I win, you lose mindset. The friction between them must have been unbelievable.
It was a powder keg. And it wasn't just about trading goods like spices or sugar. We have to talk about the Asiento.
Right. The sources highlight this specifically.
Yes. This is a term that comes up a lot in the treaties of the era, and it really highlights the cynical, brutal nature of this global competition.
The Asiento was a contract. Right.
Yes.
Yep.
Specifically, it was a monopoly contract issued by the Spanish crown, giving a foreign company the exclusive right to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish colonies.
Which is just, it's a staggering thing to think about as a business contract.
It is. Think about the logistics of that. Spain needed labor for their mines and plantations, but they didn't have the naval network in West Africa to get it themselves. So they outsourced the slave trade.
And the other powers, the British, the Dutch, the French, they actually fought wars to win this contract.
They did. In 1713, as part of the Treaty of Utrecht, Britain won the Asiento, and it was considered a major diplomatic victory in London. It shows us that the transatlantic slave trade wasn't just some side effect of empire. It was a central pillar of the global economy, completely codified in international law.
And as these economic interests collided, the conflicts got bigger and bigger. We aren't just talking about border skirmishes anymore. We are talking about global war.
The scale escalates dramatically. By the mid-18th century, the distinctions between a trade dispute and total war just vanish.
Right, it all bleeds together.
Exactly. You have the War of the Spanish Succession from 1701 to 1714, which was a fight over the Spanish crown and its colonies. And this culminates in the 7 Years' War, lasting from 1756 to 1763.
I've heard historians refer to the 7 Years' War as the actual First World War.
It absolutely was. And to give you a sense of the butterfly effect here, a skirmish in the backwoods of Pennsylvania involving a young British officer named George Washington sets off a chain reaction.
And suddenly the whole world is on fire.
Yes. Suddenly you have battles happening simultaneously in North America, in the Caribbean, in West Africa, in India, and across Europe.
It's the first time in history where the globe is a single theater of war.
It is. France and Britain were fighting for total global supremacy. And the outcome of this war regrew the map completely. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 essentially kicked France out of North America.
Britain took over.
Britain seized Canada, Florida, and secured dominance in India. It really set the stage for the British Empire to become the global hegemon.
But it also set the stage for the American Revolution, didn't it? Because global wars are expensive.
Exactly. Britain won the world, but they nearly bankrupted themselves doing it. They had to tax their colonies to pay for the war debt, and we all know how the American colonies felt about that.
So if we step back and look at this entire period we've been discussing, from Da Gama sailing around Africa to the Treaty of Paris, what is the big synthesis here? We started with a map that had blank spaces and dragons on it.
We went from a Mediterranean-centered commerce system to an Atlantic and Indian Ocean global network. The center of gravity for human wealth and power shifted entirely.
But the cost was staggering.
The cost was horrific. We always have to remember that this ascendant was built on the demographic collapse of indigenous civilizations due to disease and the rapid growth of transatlantic slavery. The modern global economy was quite literally forged in that fire.
And those patterns of inequality and even cultural exchange, they are still with us today.
They are deeply embedded in our modern world. The trade routes established by the Dutch and Portuguese are still the major shipping lanes of today. The military technology race started here.
Right.
The banking systems invented in Amsterdam are the direct ancestors of Wall Street.
Which brings up a really provocative thought for me. Based on all these sources, we talked about how the Pope tried to draw a line on the map to control the world with the Treaty of Tordesillas.
Right.
And how it failed because the challengers, the Dutch, the French, the English, they proved that global influence can't be contained by lines on a map. They found ways to work around it through complex networks and finance.
It's the line mentality versus the network mentality. The network always wins.
So are we seeing that again today? When I look at the modern world, the way digital empires are expanding, tech giants racing to control data centers or undersea cables or digital supply chains, it feels like we are back to the trade coast model.
That is a fascinating parallel. In the 21st century, you don't need to conquer a country's territory to control it. You just need to own its digital infrastructure, its connection points, its data.
Right, you just own the toll booth again.
Exactly. We might be moving away from the territorial empire model of the 19th and 20th centuries and circling back to a digital version of the early Portuguese or the Dutch model, controlling the nodes of connection.
The medium changes, but the game stays the same.
The game is always about connection and control.
Well, on that thought about digital empires, we are going to wrap up this deep dive. We've covered everything from the spice ports of India to the boardrooms of Amsterdam. Hopefully, the next time you look at a map, you see the invisible networks that hold it all together. Thanks for exploring this with us.
A pleasure to be here.
We'll catch you on the next deep dive.